Hi everyone, and welcome to Module 1 of Contemporary Issues of Corrections. Now throughout this course, we're going to examine many of the issues that are shaping today's correctional system. But before we dive into these contemporary debates though, it's important to understand where our correctional system came from and how the historical philosophies of punishment continue to influence the policies that we see today. So I want to ask the first question, what's the purpose of punishment? Right? This sounds like an easy question, but it's actually one of the oldest and most important debates in criminal justice. If you ask 10 people what the goals of the correctional system are, you're probably going to get 10 different responses. And that's because there's 4 different broad philosophies out there. And throughout history, each of these broad philosophies has influenced our correctional system in some way. And you'll continue to see all 4 of these reflected in our modern correctional system. So let's talk about those 4 real fast. The first philosophy of punishment is retribution. And retribution is based on the belief that people should be punished because they commit a crime. The focus is not anything, we don't care about changing behavior, we don't care about preventing future crime. This is simply punishment as a moral response to wrongdoing. Individuals should be held accountable because they violated the law and therefore they caused harm to others. So they should be harmed as retribution. Done. The second philosophy of punishment is incapacitation. Incapacitation focuses on the public safety aspect. So if I want to stop an offender from committing additional crimes against society, I want to protect society from that person. And so I'm going to do that via incapacitating them. So the logic is pretty straightforward, right? If someone is incarcerated, they don't have the ability to victimize people in the community. And we see this in our modern system, things like lengthy prison sentences, habitual offender laws, mandatory minimum sentences. All of these are justified typically using an incarceration argument. The third philosophy is deterrence. So deterrence argues that punishment discourages criminal behavior. And you may remember from other criminal justice courses that you've taken that there are 2 different types of deterrence, right? So we have specific deterrence, and that focuses on the individual person. So Robert shoplifts, he gets caught, and he's punished. Under specific deterrence, that punishment stops Robert from shoplifting again. General deterrence, on the other hand, focuses on everyone else. So if Susanna sees Robert get caught and punished, Susanna goes, ooh, I don't want to do that because I don't want to get punished like that. And so now Susanna's not going to shoplift. So capital punishment, for example, has often been justified using deterrence arguments. Although, to be honest, the evidence supporting its actual deterrent effect remains highly debated. But that's the goal of it. If I know that the penalty is death and I see somebody else get put to death, I don't want to do it because I don't want to get put to death. Now, the final punishment philosophy is rehabilitation. And rehabilitation approaches crime from a pretty different perspective. So rather than viewing criminal behavior as something deserving punishment, rehabilitation focuses on addressing the underlying factors that contributed to the offending in the first place. And so they're really looking there to help individuals develop the skills that they need to live successfully in the community. And we see this in our modern system with educational programs, substance abuse treatment, mental health services, job skills training, etc. Now, as I mentioned, the challenge in modern corrections is that our system is not built on just one of these philosophies. And it really reflects the combination of all 4. Although there have been different points in our history where different philosophies have dominated, most Americans today see value in multiple of these punishment philosophies. And so as a result, our modern correctional policy often is attempting to balance these different competing goals rather than just saying, okay, we're going to go with this one philosophy exclusively. So how did we get here, right? Well, early American punishments typically focused on public justice. Things like corporal punishment, public humiliation, fines, even executions were common methods of holding offenders accountable. Jails existed, but they were typically used as short-term holding facilities for individuals that were awaiting either their trial or their punishment. And we really hadn't done a lot with long-term incarceration. That wasn't a big response to crime. You went to jail, you waited for your punishment, and then that got carried out in some public way. Now, over time, we see that changing, and during much of the 20th century, rehabilitation became the dominant philosophy within corrections. There was a lot of optimism in the early 1900s, like offenders can be treated, correctional interventions could reduce future criminal behavior, and we gave a lot of leeway then to the system. So we see judges getting broad discretion when they were imposing sentences, and we also see the creation of things like parole boards that could determine if there were situations where the punishment could be ended early or when the offender could be released. Now, then we hit the 1970s, and the optimism over rehabilitation starts to fade. And one of the biggest issues came this publication. It was a review of existing correctional programs in the 1970s, and it came out with this term, nothing works. And it led to what we actually call the nothing works perspective. And basically what had happened was a researcher did research on the different correctional programs that were coming out and said, hey, they don't really help. We're spending a lot of money on rehabilitation, and rehabilitation isn't working. And what happened later on is we figured out it's not that rehabilitation wasn't working, it's that the programs that they were studying weren't actually implemented in the way that they were designed. So there was really more of an implementation issue rather than like a rehabilitation issue. But what happened is that nothing works perspective really became a really catchy soundbite, essentially. And so even though later on we learned actually that's not really the case, the political narrative about this sense of nothing works, rehabilitation's a waste of time, that became pretty strongly ingrained in our political system. And we still see that today sometimes. So what happens then is now we're in the 1970s, 1980s, we're losing confidence in rehabilitation, right? And so we see an increase in policymakers who are emphasizing, again, punishment, incapacitation. We start seeing longer sentences, stricter sentences, the elimination of the one-on-one, looking at individual backgrounds and just saying, nope, if you do this, everybody gets the same policy. And so from that era, we see things like the Tough on Crime initiatives, mandatory minimum sentencing, 3 strikes laws, our war on drugs. All of these now contribute to the expansion of the criminal justice system and the correctional system in the following decades. But the story doesn't end there, right? So now we're past that time. And over the last several decades, we spent a lot of time, researchers and academics and prisons and program nonprofits, researchers have spent a lot of time looking at the body of evidence around correctional interventions. And most correctional scholars reject the idea that absolutely nothing works. But what they say, though, is it's more nuanced now. So now we don't necessarily say, hey, does this work? We say, what is this work for whom and under what circumstances? And also, how do we have to implement this in order to do this correctly? So recognizing that every prisoner in our correctional system is not going to be served the same by the same program. So it's not nothing works, but some things work better for certain individuals with certain histories and certain offense types. And so it's that tailoring of what works for whom under what conditions. So the evidence suggests that many correctional programs can actually reduce recidivism and they can improve incomes. We have research supporting that. But they have to be, the programs themselves have to be based on research. The programs have to be appropriately targeted to offender needs, and they have to be delivered with fidelity to the program's goals. And all of these things are not necessarily always taken for granted. And so again, the question is not whether rehabilitation works, but whether which interventions are effective and who they are effective for. Now, as we move through this course, I want you to keep these 4 philosophies of punishment in mind. Nearly every correctional policy we discuss, from sentencing and prison management to probation, parole, prisoner reentry, all of these issues go back to one of those 4 underlying philosophies of punishment. And understanding these competing perspectives and how they compete and how they work together can help you better evaluate correctional policies going forward. And it can help you understand why sometimes things that we do in the correctional system doesn't work the way we want it to. And it can be because of all these goals kind of hitting at each other in the head. So Throughout this course, I want you to really approach each topic with curiosity and a critical mindset. I don't want you to just accept our correctional policies at face value. I want you to actively ask things about them. What problem was this policy intended to solve? When we built this prison, when we created this program, when we created a sentencing policy, what were we actually trying to solve? Did we actually try it? Did we actually solve it? Of course, that's always an important part. Who benefited from that? Was it the prisoners? Was it society? Was it only a certain type of prisoner? Things like that. Who was harmed? And sometimes this can be intentional harm. So we knew this was going to happen as a result of the policy. But we also have a lot of policies that we put out in good faith that then end up penalizing people. And in my own background, I researched sex offender policy. We've done a lot of things for public safety that do actually have negative impacts on the offenders beyond what we expected the negative impact to be. And so there's just a recognition that sometimes when we do things, there are collateral damage consequences that happen. And so recognizing when those happen, who those happen to, so that we can do an adequate policy analysis and determine, is this the best path forward? Is this the best path forward, or is there a better way to do this? And finally, are there reforms that are supported by empirical evidence? So if we're doing something and it's not working, or it is creating harm, or it isn't working for all the offenders, is there a way we can adjust it based on the empirical evidence that we have today? Now, these questions, those are ones I want you to really sit with, because these are going to just guide our discussions throughout the semester. And what you've already seen, corrections is not black and white. Policies are often created with good intentions, but they may not create the outcomes that policymakers expected. And so understanding to analyze and being interested and curious about both the intended and the unintended consequences of correctional policy is one of the central goals of this course. Now, one of the things that we're going to do in this course to help you really understand this conflict is that we're going to really look at the people who experience these decisions or these systems firsthand. It's easy for us when we're sitting out here, we're not in the correctional system. If we're looking at statistics or budgets or political debates, we can lose sight of the individual people who are actually being impacted by what's happening. And so to help make these issues more concrete for you, what I've done is I've created a prisoner case study assignment where each of you is going to follow a fictional offender throughout the semester. Your offender will enter the correctional system with a unique background, with an offense history, with their own strengths, weaknesses, and risk factors. And as we move through the modules, you're going to examine how the philosophies, policies, and practices that we talk about that week are actually impacting your specific person. And my goal is that you then will better understand how the correctional systems function, who they serve well, where they fall short, and how our policy decisions affect people in real and sometimes unexpected ways. By following one person throughout the semester, I hope that you're going to move beyond that abstract feeling and really get a deeper understanding of the strengths and limitations of our contemporary correctional setting. One last thing I do want to mention. During this course, I don't expect everyone to reach the same conclusions. In fact, some of our best discussions are going to come from respectful disagreement. My hope is not that you'll parrot my ideas back to you. My hope is that you'll gain the skills to recognize how these philosophies affect our correctional system and how the correctional system can be improved long-term through enhancement, redirection, revision, deletion, addition, whatever we need to do to our existing practices to make things better for all Americans, those in the system and those outside of it too. I hope you enjoy the discussions, and I look forward to going through this semester with you. Thanks, everyone.